Hello everyone and welcome to another very nice game from the Steinitz Memorial. Yesterday we've seen a game where Magnus had the white pieces against Svidler and he went for that, c3 followed by c4 idea, which in the end ended in a draw, but both players had their chances. But now we are checking out the game where Svidler has the white pieces, and it's also a very interesting game. So hope you enjoyed the podcast yesterday and my game against MVL. If you still haven't seen it, I will put links to both the podcast and my game against MVL in the description below. So do check it out, as it was very enjoyable, at least for me. So getting back to this one, and also I mentioned in the previous video that the Steinitz Memorial is a part of the Carlsen chess tour, which is not. I mixed it up with the online chess masters tournament, which is not this one. So this is not a part of the Carlsen chess tour, just straighten that out. So getting back to the game, Svidler with the white pieces opens with e4. We have e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. The Ruy Lopez is on the board, and now knight to f6 by Magnus. Goes for the Berlin defense. We have d3 and d6. And they will be following the game Carlsen played against Firuja, also with the black pieces in the Tata Steel Masters in January. So castles and bishop to e7, or everything the same as in the game against Firuja. We have c3, castles, and rook to e1. So basically all standard Berlin stuff. We have a6, bishop to a4, and rook to e8, knight b to d2. And here we reach the position where Carlsen played bishop to f8 against Firuja in the Tata Steel Masters. But here he goes for b5 first. So pushing the bishop back, bishop to c2, and only now bishop to f8. We have d4, striking in the center now that the e4 pawn has sufficient defense, and bishop to b7 by Magnus. We have a4, already attacking here the expanded pawn on b5, and now knight to b8 by Magnus, preparing c5, or rather making room for the c pawn so you can move it. And here bishop to d3 by Svidler, stopping c5, because c5 would be just met with a captures on b5, and you lose the pawn here. So Carlsen cannot play c5, or rather you can. There actually is one game in the database where c5 was played here, but Carlsen chooses c6, and it is as of move 13 that we have a completely new game. So we have b3, Svidler prepares now to fianchetto his dark square bishop, and knight b to d7 now. The knight is coming to b6, we have queen to c2, developing the queen, and now queen to c7. Carlsen does the same, bishop to b2, and now knight to h5. Carlsen now wants to shift the knight over to f4, and if Svidler wants to kick it away, he will have to weaken the king side with the g3. So first Svidler prepares it, bishop to f1, gains control of the light squares here. We have knight to f4, and now g3, kicking the knight away. Also the bishop covers the h3 square, so you have to go back, knight to e6, and now b4 by Svidler. We have knight to b6 here. Carlsen is inviting Svidler to push a5, but if you push a5, then with the queen side being locked down, black is the one who will be choosing when there will be a breakthrough in the position. So here instead Svidler trades with a captures to c captures, and now it is kind of tough with this backwards c3 pawn, but Svidler immediately finds a way how to get rid of it. He plays d5, attacks the knight here, and now if you move back, let's say an idea, then you go c4, and you no longer have to worry about your backward c3 pawn, and also you free your dark square bishop. So instead Magnus went knight to d4, as you cannot capture, because your queen would be hanging on c2. So knight captures on d4, we have e captures on d4, and now only c4. So here Svidler again gets rid of his backward c3 pawn and opens up an attack against Carlsen's d4 pawn. So rook a to c8, putting more pressure on the c4 pawn, and here Svidler grabs the d4 pawn. So bishop captures, knight captures, and now we have captures on c4. B captures on c4, and now rook a to c1. Svidler wants to eliminate Carlsen's passed c pawn, but Carlsen finds a very nice way how to complicate matters. He pushes f5, wants to weaken the d5 pawn. So now obviously if you capture it, then you can just capture here, it's not a problem. So Svidler finds bishop to h3, preventing this idea, as the rook on c8 would hang, and now you don't really have a good way of continuing this. So Magnus finds basically the only way to play with black. He sacrifices the exchange on c8, so f captures on e4, We have bishop captures on c8, rook captures on c8, and now queen captures on e4, and queen to f7. So sacrificing the exchange, but he still has the bishop pair, he has the passed c pawn, and he will win the d4 pawn, which will give him a lot of pressure along this diagonal. So queen g4 by Svidler puts pressure on the g7 pawn, and the queen captures on d5 now, threatening queen to g2 or queen to h1 checkmate. So queen to e6 check, the only move that gives white some advantage, so trading the queens. We have queen captures, rook captures, and now comes king to f7, attacking the rook and the rook back to e3. Keeping an eye on the c3 square, and now Magnus will try. He is up a pawn and he still has the bishop pair. So what he wants is to somehow create a setup that these pawns can start marching forward. So he starts with bishop to d5. We have bishop to c3 by Svidler, so still keeping an eye on that g7 pawn. The bishop is very nicely placed on this diagonal, and also you just want to block the c4 pawn, and also keep an eye on the d pawn by controlling the d4 square. So bishop to c6, of course Magnus will somehow try to get this pawn rolling down the board. We have rook to a1 going after the pawn here, and now rook to a8. Here we go rook back to e1. And now comes d5. So still you don't really have a good way of playing d4. Rook to f3 check, king g8, and now rook to e6, putting the pressure on the bishop. We have rook to c8 defending, and rook to f4 now. And now with the bishop blockading the c pawn and the bishop and rook controlling the d4 square, it will be very hard for Magnus to execute d4 here. So bishop to b5 now, and here we have h4. Starting to push the h-pawn up the board to really put pressure on black's king side. We have rook to d8 now. Somehow maybe you can somehow get let's say g6 or maybe bishop to g7 in to either get rid of the dark square bishop or maybe just start pushing the pawn. But it's still a long way to go from here. So rook to b6. Now you already have ideas of putting more pressure on the g7 pawn. The bishop still controls this diagonal. You can go rook b7 to further attack it. You can go rook g4 to add another attacker. So a lot of ideas here for white. Magnus goes bishop to d6, attacks the rook, and rook to g4 now. Now there of course is the threat of just rook captures on g7. So rook to d7 defends it. And now h5 by Svidler. Bishop captures on g7 is also just winning, but not also, bishop g7 is winning here, but he goes for h5 first, and now h6 by Magnus. And here rook to g6, still not going for this bishop captures on g7 idea, as after the rook moves you will be able to recapture here, but rather now creating a double attack on the bishop here. But it's 3+2, of course, both players being very low on time. You don't have a lot of time to calculate lines. So bishop to f8, the bishop again defends the g7 pawn, and now bishop to d4. You don't want to meet d4 here, so bishop d4. And here Carlsen misses the idea of rook to c7. With rook to c7, you are threatening to just push and promote your pawn, and the problem is after bishop to c3, you still push d4, and you will have a much better position. Bishop captures, you're going to go c3, and after you get this position, then it's just much better with the pass pawn already being on c2. However, Magnus went bishop captures on b4. He decided to grab this and create two connected pass pawns, but now it no longer works. Now Svidler played rook to b8 with check. We have king to h7, and now feel free to pause the video and try to find the winning move for Svidler, as it is an unstoppable mate in 5. So feel free to try and find it while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting that you have to prevent the king from reaching the g5 square. And from those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's f4. That's the stuff. And now there really isn't much you can do here. It doesn't really matter what you play. The continuation is pretty much the same. If you move the rook away from the defense of the pawn, then obviously just rook captures on g7 will be checkmate. So here Magnus played c3. He started pushing his pass pawn, but now comes the move you had to see in order to find f4. It's rook captures on h6 with check. And it was in this position on move 48 that Magnus Carlsen resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. And yes, it is quite similar to Carlsen's queen captures on h6 against Sergei Karyakin in their World Chess Championship match, which basically basically clinched him the title. Point is that it doesn't matter what you capture with. If you capture with the pawn, rook to h8 is mate, as the bishop defends it, and the pawn prevents the king from reaching g6. And of course, if you capture with the king, now you see the importance of the f4 move. Rook to h8 is checkmate because the king cannot reach the g5 square. So really awesome stuff by Svidler, finding both f4 and this rook captures an h6 idea. So nicely done. And yeah, Magnus didn't take advantage of his chance with the white pieces, so going for that c3 idea, and now Svidler retaliates in full capacity with a beautiful game like this. So yeah, after rook captures an h6, Magnus resigned, and we're going to cover a few more games, and then we're going to check out the standings of the Steinitz Memorial. So that's it for the moment. Once again, do check out the podcast if you haven't, and also my game against MVL. Both links will be in the description below. I would like to thank Nicholas Bruno, Peter Keller, Shah Prayash, Vishnu Mokapati, and Mark Pryor for contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check two of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Morphy saga and checking up on whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your Sunday.